The Portland State University Oral History Project focuses on Oregon land use planning program. It provides the opportunity for key participants to recount stories and anecdotes regarding how this unique program was developed, implemented, and evolved over its more than 4 decades in existence. It is May 10th, 2017. My name is Michael Rupp. I'm a former Department of Land Conservation Development staff member. And with me is my former colleague, Jim Knight. With us today is Rick Bastasch, formerly the Strategic Planning Administrator of the Oregon Water Resources Department. Welcome, and thanks for agreeing to be interviewed.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll start out with kind of a brief personal background.
Okay.
So how did you get to Oregon?
Well, like my parents, I was born and raised in Portland, so I've been here some time. And grew up in the 50s and 60s in Oregon, which was, big timber and, half the people that we have now. And sort of enjoyed family vacations to the beach, into the mountains, into the desert, and picked up an appreciation for natural resources that way. And when I got to college, I decided that it would be a good thing to, take natural resources courses, and so I got a bachelor's in general science because it was an earth science focus before they had an earth science program.
Where was this?
At Oregon State University. Okay. I'm sorry.
Okay.
And then I, after graduation, I worked for the Forest Service for a time, and then decided to go back to school, and I got my master's again at Oregon State University in geography, which gave me my first exposure, I think, to land use planning. They had land use planning courses and practicum.
And about what year was that?
This would have been in 82. Okay. I graduated in 84.
So the program was up and running then.
Yes, it was. And actually, my master's research program was helping my major professor, Jim Pease, try to take a look at...
you know that name.
Yes.
Do you?
Yeah, we're going to try to get Jim if we
can wonderful.
interview.
Took a look at sort of agricultural parcel sizes in Lynn County and one other county that escapes my memory. Just tried to sort of better understand how.
Is that a Valley County? The other?
I don't even remember, Jim. So I mean, there was an exposure to Oregon's land use planning program in my graduate program, and then after that. I started working for the Oregon Water Resources Department in 1984, and I think I was there until like 1996. Yes, I think.
What's that, 20?
It's 12, I think, yeah.
And you mentioned positions. What positions did you hold at Water Resources?
Well, I came on in a limited duration position that first was really clerical almost, in that it was trying to computerize water rights records, and then the more I was around and got involved in some other activities, became basically a water resources planner, and then program coordinator, and then I moved into the director's office and oversaw the division that had to do with strategic plan. I helped develop the department's first strategic plan. We had hearings in our division, legislative coordination, that sort of thing.
Okay, as you look back over the last 40 years, which of the state's natural resources do you believe the state planning program has been the most successful in protecting?
I think farm and forest land.
Okay.
I think that's a big success. I think that's, in terms of looking at contrasts between states that might have a program similar to Oregon and those that don't. I think we have very visible demarcation between urban and rural lands. I think there is a thriving still interest in the agricultural community to preserve agricultural lands. I think we have good, we have protection forest lands. So I think that's a pretty robust result, particularly given the rate of population growth in Oregon.
Okay.
How much did water play for you? Obviously, that was your agency's mission, but in terms of interacting with issues involving agricultural land protection, or is that too much of a
Yeah.
question?
No, I mean, it's certainly embedded in sort of the permitting legacy of the Water Resources Department. I mean, to the extent that, you know, we may get to it later too, but by the time I came on board the Water Resources Department, there was really no more water to allocate. I mean, it was an exercise in issuing paper permits that, for the most part, probably would be shut off during the summer season, just because there were greater calls on water that had an older priority date. So our relationship to agricultural land use was largely through enforcement, I think. Not that I was involved with that, but I mean, through the water masters, you know, if you have a senior water right and you're not getting what you think you ought to get, you call the water master and say, turn off these younger water rights upstream. So I think just by virtue of Western water law and essentially the kind of thematic base of it, which was very progressive in its time, but it was to provide for the orderly allotment of lands and water, help with homesteading, make sure there was rights of record, and that there was a you know, recognizable process for delineating those kinds of property rights. So actually, at the time, because we were under great pressure to try to correct historic neglect of in-stream water rights, either for scenic waterways, the DIAC flows, or for minimum stream flows, and you know, there was a great expectation that the department rebalance, you know, how water's allocated in Oregon, which wasn't easy to do, because you really didn't, there was no decision space really, but it was apparent to the agricultural community that was a change. It wasn't the Water Resources Department or the State Engineer's Office they used to know that was kind of like with them.
Yeah.
It was like, oh, you've got
the competing interests out there now.
You've got competing interests, and it had an urban kind of flavor to it, I think. You had environmentalists pushing the department to do crazy things like saying fish had water rights, you know, and stuff like that. So I don't know, that's not a great answer to your question, Jim, but you know, it's there were sort of like precursors, or sort of what am I trying to say, a predicate to how we dealt with ag that you know, it really didn't have us do a lot of water supply planning, for example, for you know, additional storage or something like that.
It's kind of like the land use program. I mean, it just gets more complicated. There's more people that are aware of varying needs, and they have to be addressed. And so you were facing pressures from fish and other things. Forestry got involved probably with the cutting. To some degree, when we got into, we wanted to be on the side of riparian areas at that time. There was, you know, there was fairly new but compelling research about the role of streamside vegetation in preserving flows. Right. So when we began expressing interest in that, and temperature especially, you know, forestry kind of, you know, in a way couldn't quite get their heads around that kind of interest, because, you know, to them that was kind of like, let us take care of that through the Forest Practices Act. We're doing fine, and you know, you guys go back to you know, being water masters. So you know, there was a little bit of, you know, you know, adjustment, and as our kind of mission evolved. Did it vary by region, your pressures and some of the variations and what you needed to do? I mean, like the coast probably had water. Yeah. I mean, they weren't running out of water as much as maybe other parts of the state. And I don't think that there were different hot spots, I guess you could say, and I think the coast actually does have water supply challenges because all those little coastal streams dry up. Oh yeah. You know, in summer. I mean, smaller watersheds. They're smaller watersheds, and you know, they're just kind of starved for rain until November. You know? But I think you had you know, periods of drought in Eastern Oregon, even Western Oregon, where things became acute in terms of emergency water measures. And you know, there's just differences in the water circumstances around the state. You know, some, like the Deschutes Basin,
I mean, they've got a lot of irrigation districts, and those are districts of the state, and they are authorized and resourced in a lot of ways to address a lot of water supply questions in terms of how they convey water to their customers. And so that you had varying degrees of infrastructure. That in the John Day Basin, there wasn't that so much. When we went to the John Day Basin, there's a different picture than when you go to the Deschutes.
Do federal and state, scenic waterways, and that's not the right description, but also enter into your thinking? In terms of what you could withdraw or allow to be withdrawn? Or?
It eventually did. I mean, through a state Supreme Court decision, the Dyack decision, the court found that the State Water Resources Department was obligated to take actions to preserve flow in state scenic waterways. And again, that was, I don't know how impactful it was really, because we went around and you had to do a study to say, well, how much water does a scenic waterway need? Well, it depends what it was designated for. It's for recreation. Is it recreation for boating? Or is it for for motorboating? Is it for kayaking? Is it a scenic waterway that has that manifests most value for fish? And so you have to go through a heretofore undone calculus to kind of say, well, it looks like you need this quantity of water, and whether or not that quantity of water was available any longer. And so that kind of basically what it did is you created minimum stream flows, eventually become in-stream water rights that, in essence, sort of what was the key that turned the lock on any additional appropriation in those upstream of those basins. So the state scenic waterway statute sort of came into play in terms of this exercise that was more confessional, I think, than efficient. As the state, acting through the state engineer's office and the Water Resources Department for the last 80 years, kind of messed up. We didn't, it wasn't in statute to protect fish or water quality flows, so we didn't. We understand that we should have, and it would be a good thing to build back toward, but there's no instant solution when you give fish basically a 1984, 85, 86 priority date, a water right, when in that same basin there are water rights dating from 1850. That you can't leverage a lot of water from that. But federal wild and scenic, I don't know if there's any litigation around that, but we kind of began to work with the Forest Service when they were, before the spotted owl stuff hit, when they were redoing their forest plans, to begin to work with them to kind of quantify what today we call environmental flows. So
you mentioned court decision.
The Dyack Supreme Court decision.
Is it Oregon Supreme Court?
Yeah, Oregon Supreme Court.
Okay. When was that? What is the year? And can you explain that a little bit?
Again, it was Arch Dyack in the Sandy that sued the Water Resources Department for essentially over allocating water that otherwise should have remained in stream, he thought, to support purposes of the Sandy Scenic Waterway. And the Supreme Court essentially agreed with him, and so we had to again develop protocols and and ways to.
Did you participate in those proceedings at all? Not you personally, but I mean the agency. Did you take,
Well, our AAG.
Yes. Who was that at that time?
Steve Sanders.
Okay, I know the name generally, but
yeah. I think he was. He must have had help, but that I was, if you will, a lower echelon employee at that time, and that was way beyond my ken. And the decision came down, and it came to the planners to try to, work through a legal pathway so we would comply with the court order.
Do the state agencies that were affected by or interested in water, i.e. fish and wildlife, forestry, ag, DEQ, did you guys have a common game plan, or were you all?
At that time, I'm pretty sure we didn't. There was a fair amount of friction between the Oregon Water Resources Department and ODSW fisheries biologists, and
And
DEQ not so much.
Were those technical differences or more egos?
Well, it wasn't egos. I think it was frustration. I mean, when you know how passionate people can be.
Right.
They follow a life interest through school and into career,
Right.
and yeah, particularly at that time to preserve and protect the environment was kind of a high calling. And I think a lot of the fish biologists and the people that work for ODFW, and probably to some extent this is still true, are witnessing the decline of what they care most about and what they're charged by statute to protect. And so when they see other, agents of the state maybe not cooperating or not,
Kind of helping
thank
fulfill
you,
their
being
mission.
being of assistance.
Yeah.
And I think we, as a department, did about all we could, but again, all we could amounted to not a lot, because again, in Western water law, once you have issued a water right, which they're issued in perpetuity, you're kind of stuck.
They take precedence
And so, there was I think just a frustration that, that situation existed at all, and that there wasn't an elegant or ready solution. I mean, to the extent that we could do anything, we stopped over appropriating water. We tried to, and I wasn't involved in the conservation program, but we tried to emphasize conservation. And these are slow kind of corrections to what are urgent problems. So it was it was testy. I mean, they and two, I think there are cultures. I mean, when you have a statewide agency, and our field crews particularly had to work side by side with people they go to church with, or their sons and daughters go to high school with, and I think there was a local sympathy toward agriculture that probably was apparent to ODFW staff, and so I think that that's got into culture a little bit, I think.
Are there land use policy subjects or topics that are missing from the comprehensive plans that LCDT through its statewide planning goals should have required local governments to address?
This is similar to a question that you may ask me later on, but I don't know. I mean, and I should have stipulated earlier that I touched on land use topics in my career, but I'm far from expert in them. I guess as a lifelong Oregonian, I've observed some things, and so this is just, there's a lot of subjective opinion, particularly in what I'm about to say here. It's almost like, it's not that the plans were comprehensive enough, but maybe they were too much so. I mean, at the time Senate Bill 100 was passed, I mean, it was kind of the only game in town. And if you take a look at the goals, I mean, they're
It covers quite a bit of it.
well, yeah, I mean, it's not, they're not just land use, they're kind of life.
Yeah.
They're, housing, energy conservation, just recreation, economic development. All these things are, of course, integrated with land use. But, so what's missing? It's not.
Are there things the plans could have done to help water resources? Maybe that's another way of terming it.
Maybe. I looked at goal 5 before I came here. The fit of water in the goals is not great.
Yeah.
Like goal 5, that came out at a time when, there was no Endangered Species Act, there was no Clean Water Act, there may not have been a Federal Forest Planning Act. But it's kind of, goal 5 is kind of like,
It's a catch-all.
yeah, catch-all. Thank you.
For resources.
But if you take a look at the guidance, I think it says something about inventorying riparian areas and making sure there's sufficient flow, quote, and groundwater is mentioned, And there was just at that, if there had been more time and better ways to actually do an inventory, and there's talk about carrying capacity,
That's the term I was just gonna-
which is, you know, again, for the Water Resources Department,
How do you
a
capture that,
moot,
but
a
yet-
moot point.
But it's important. Yeah.
But, you know, it's, I don't know at that time that anybody could have done anything more. If we were to do it again today, I mean, we have stuff like LiDAR. We have a far better groundwater network, though, according to the Oregonian, not good enough, and it's true. We have a far better understanding of stream flow and snowpacks. Our inventory capability and understanding is better. If that had been available and could have been incorporated into comprehensive plans, it probably would have been a good thing. But it didn't happen, and I don't know if it could have happened.
Yeah, we've had this discussion with other people we've interviewed regarding the ability to have data available to make decisions back when we were starting this
Yeah.
program. And
Yeah.
we just, now, if we started it today, it would be much different in that respect.
In that respect, I think it would be, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Special districts, did they play a role? They must have in certain communities, obviously, or certain areas of the state.
Well, yeah.
Both for urban as well as rural uses.
Yeah, I mean, they were particularly irrigation districts, and you had, and to a lesser degree, there's sort of these kind of more elf-like districts, you know, water control districts, and again, they are agents of the state with their own sets of statutory authority, and you know, some have you know, enough resources to have clout politically, you know, some big irrigation districts, so they, you know, they were paid attention to, because they, you know, they were a form of government.
Do you believe the statewide planning goals strike a balance between state and local control?
That's an easy question.
Yeah, I know. Well, overall, I think they do. I think that probably varies through time. I think when the program was first starting out, it was a state-imposed program, basically. And well, I think most of the 277 jurisdictions were made to do it. You know, some had, you know, plans and zoning ordinances already. I think the framework is designed for that balance. And I think it kind of depends where and who you are. I think Washington County probably has a different relationship with the state than Harney County does. I think the resources that you have, that you're able to draw on, the people that you're able to employ, the legislators that you have in your area, all matter. You know, so I think you know the Burns City Council. I mean, I think they, if there was something that was not to their liking, I don't think they could put up as good a fight as Washington County. So I mean, you know, I think there's that balance probably varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction a little bit.
Did you have, like we did, field people that would live in the communities or regions of the state, so you could have people that would actually be in touch with local governments and landowners and so forth?
That was a capacity that grew while I was there.
While you were there.
There's always been a county water master. It's actually a creature of the state, but it was called the county water master.
Yeah.
And maybe...
And he was connected to your
Was he an
department?
employee of Water Resources?
Yeah,
Of water.
and sometimes there were, you know, sort of MOUs where the county would kick in an assistant or something like that.
Right.
So it was, in the old-fashioned sense, it was a service to agriculture, basically. And again, as these other pressures came to be exerted on the department, a regional structure was developed. so that in addition to water masters, there was a regional manager that could, I think, have a better understanding of the management issues in their area, and sort of be have a better liaison with the commission and the director's office. And so yeah, those regional managers eventually became sort of ambassadors, really, and they worked most closely with the jurisdictions.
How many managers were there?
I forget, there's like 5 or 6 regional managers,
Right.
with an employment structure underneath them. And then, I don't know, I mean, I don't know, but I don't know how resources are arrayed right now.
Right. Wouldn't be any less, probably.
It may not be less, but it wouldn't be a great deal more either, I don't think. I mean, if you take a look at, I used to suggest, and I still do, that Oregon doesn't take water resources seriously, really. If you take, if one measure of how serious you take the management of a public resource is the number of employees devoted to managing that resource. If you take a look at forestry, thousands of employees. Agriculture, many hundreds, I would think. And in the Water Resources Department, I think it's probably 100, 150 maybe people. And with 19 or 20 water masters, in theory, to manage 100,000 water rights.
That many? Seriously, that many?
Something like that. I mean, a lot of them, are kind of like, fossilized and not really active. But I mean, if you think about the Oregonian raised a ruckus, was it last winter, about how Oregon's groundwater giveaway, like this is news. I mean, no one pays anything for water. No one pays. I mean, if you are a timber operator, you bid on state forest land to buy the logs that you're taking off. If you're a cattleman person, how many animal unit months pay for that amount of grazing. Nobody pays anything for water, and in terms of groundwater resources, what we know of them is not very comforting. So, I mean, there's a big need out there. For example, in the legislature this year, there's a bill, and I don't know how well it's faring, to apply a management fee for every water right, because that's how they're trying to get at, if you will, a water use fee. But anyway, so yeah, there's regional there's a regional structure now. I think it's a healthy thing to have had happen. I think it really helped the department better integrate its programs with local jurisdictions. Let's
go to question, I think it's 8.
Okay.
Bottom of page 1.
Okay.
And you can read better than I can talk.
Okay.
ORS 197-180 establishes a general coordination requirement directing state agency planning responsibilities to focus on compliance with the statewide planning goals and compatibility with, in quotes there, acknowledged local government comprehensive plans and their implementing measures. From your experience with water resources, how would you assess your agency's overall performance in meeting the statutory requirement? There's a big mouthful for you.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a long time, Jim. I mean, my sense is that we tried really hard.
Were you the only one that was on land use, pretty much?
It was me and Roberta Jortner.
Jortner.
She's now retired from the city of Portland,
Right.
your environmental services. But we were acting in good faith, I think, and so was Bill Young, the director at that time. We spent a lot of time, and more time than I think a lot of the managers thought was required, trying to, take a hard look at how our programs fit or did not fit with the goals and with plans. And what we ended up doing, I don't think was very unusual. It was basically a form of deeming, where at the very least we began to require that if people came to us for a water right, they had to have a sign off from the local government saying that the proposed use of that water, that the land use, associated with the water use was allowed or allowable in our comprehensive plan. So that,
Would you take their word for it?
no, they had to go to the county or city and have a sign off, I think. There had to be evidence, there had to be documentation that that was so. So in terms of compatibility with compliance with local plans, you know, I think we did okay. The larger issues are the ones we were talking about minutes ago, having to do with, you know, compliance with the goals and how do you take a pre-existing condition, sort of pre-existing water deficit, and have it fit within goals that require, you know, paying attention to carrying capacity and adequate flows. So, I mean, that's just the
Of course,
problem.
once a plan was acknowledged, that is approved by our agency's commission. That's what was paramount. Because the local plan obviously took the goals and addressed them and
Yeah.
reviewed them, and after much back and forth over years and years, said, yes, you've met the goals,
Mhm.
and we'll continue to meet them as time went on, and so.
Which basically meant that it reflected the state's interest, those
That's
plans.
the key thing I want to get to, is the state's interest in Oregon is really expressed initially by the goals in terms of land use.
Mhm.
But then they were addressed by local governments and others, agencies,
Mhm.
to the extent that they had to comply with the local plans.
Mhm.
And that was difficult and complex. It was hard for us at times. I'm sure it was difficult and hard for you, and I hope we worked together as well as we could have in those days.
Oh, I think so.
Agency to agency.
Yeah, and you know, because again, I don't know how to articulate this, but again, when Senate Bill 100 came on scene, a lot of what drives natural resource protection and management today didn't exist. So you had this was sort of the Oregon's land use planning program, sort of the didn't anticipate, but it came before things like NEPA, or state NEPAs, you know, came before the EPA, came before Clean Water Act, and you know, I think it was filling a big need in a big space in a very ambitious way, but connected with that sort of ambitious program, I think there are governance issues, authorities, you know.
Who has the final say?
Yeah, I mean, and you know, statutes and regulations ramify. I mean, the more there are, you know, kind of. And I think, become challenging to, you know, how does the forest land goal, for example, drive or not drive the Forest Practices Act? I mean, I couldn't tell you, but you know, there's embedded sort of relationship questions or assertions here that are interesting. So,
And of course, what we had, you know, after a time, were rules, just like you did. And we have these broad expressions in statute and then by goals, and then how do we comply with those, what do they
Yeah.
mean, definitions and so forth.
Right.
And some of our rules go on for pages and pages.
well, yeah, and I think we'll get to it too, but I think that has an effect.
And you had rules too, obviously.
Oh yeah, I mean, at some point, you push rules out and create ridiculous outcomes. They may be episodic, but I mean, for example, we prohibited any further allocation from the Willamette River. And there was a guy, what was his name, Reed? He wrote. He was a syndicated columnist or a correspondent. Did Far East things, and he came back to his land in Oregon and wanted to get a water right from a river that's, you know, half a mile wide, you know, 30 feet deep, and floods in the winter. And you're saying, no, you can't dip a straw in that. And it's hard for people to understand.
Who is saying you can't do?
The state,
But who, the state?
water resources.
You guys.
Yeah, and because so much water had already been taken out, and even in summer, you know, every drop in the Willamette, even if it's coming out of a reservoir, is needed downstream in Portland, and it's hard to explain. Or we have a situation where we did the same sort of thing in the Columbia River, where in the Umatilla County area, we said you can't take any more water out of the Columbia. And the amount of water you could take out of the Columbia for any given use is probably undetectable, really. But we said it. Washington didn't say it. Washington irrigators are helping themselves to the Columbia. And Umatilla people are going, what's going on?
Yeah.
So, there's rationale behind regulation, but at any given time, it can spill out in a way to the public that just seems ridiculous. Or having a pond on your land. How bad can that be? Well, there's so many of them, and there can be so many of them that and people were putting them in willy-nilly in the 50s and 60s with the help of the federal government without getting a state water right, and then they find themselves in a undocumented, if you will, situation. And you go to tell somebody, that pond that you got there, you got to take it out. Well, okay, wait, give me a water right for it. We don't do that anymore. So I mean, it's these pages and pages of rules are just hugely complex, and they often sort of are written around exceptions based on the political need of the day, just like taxes, tax code. And so, it gets at some point, it just gets hard for people to kind of square that circle in their mind, and I think that's why we had those ballot measures.
We have that with court cases sometimes.
Oh.
They come in and all of a sudden we're headed down a path in one direction, the court case comes in, and we wondered where they came up with that direction, because we were definitely going someplace else.
Yeah.
And then we were required to rewrite the rules or amend the goal.
Yeah.
We even had cases where we had to go back and change the goals to basically undo the damage the court decision did.
Hugely complicated.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And it would make for outcomes that nobody could explain.
Exactly,
Yeah.
and that's very damaging.
Yeah. It is.
And yeah.
Or
So-
interpret. We had multiple different interpretations.
Yeah.
You can do that too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then you go off and get your attorney or.
And with every settlement or court decision, the granularity of those rules increases, and at some point, to me, the whole regulatory apparatus becomes disjunct from the original purpose.
Yeah.
You get so involved, fighting
Focused
over
on one thing.
semicolons,
Yeah.
that something else happens.
Yeah. I always like it, at the Water Resources example, is somebody throwing a rock in the pond.
Yeah.
The ripple effect.
Mhm.
People that throw the rock think it's nothing, but as far as rulemaking goes, the unintended consequences that reverberate out there, sometimes you don't even understand.
Well, they're unpredictable.
Yeah.
Yeah, you don't know where it's being driven sometimes.
Turning the page. We're asking you to give us your thoughts about the program right now, and recognizing you've been away from, like we have,
Yeah.
from the day-to-day in 2017 compared with the program when you were working with the state government. And maybe you can say, I don't know, and that's a good answer. Whoever wrote that probably ought to have.
I don't have an informed opinion on that.
What about just, off the wall thoughts? Do you have anything that would be helpful?
Or your program too,
Or
by the
your-
way, your
Um,
reflections on it.
Yeah. I don't know what to do with this one. I mean, I guess on the one hand, I'm comforted that there is still a program.
Right. 'Cause
It's still functioning.
We've gone to the ballot box.
Exactly. There's still protection, and there remains, I think, a store of, if not goodwill, then with sort of our planning program writ large. It seems right now that, maybe it feels like the pressures on the program today have more to do with, I was going to say urban growth boundaries. I mean, we're just getting so many more people so quickly. I think the rate of population growth is increasing, and it just seems that it's feeling that, to me, that forest land protection is probably not the issue that it once was. Agricultural land use protection, kind of perennial, like can you put solar panels on land now? I don't know. So it's hard for me to say, really.
Mm-hmm. Would an evaluation of the program, and I use that word somewhat without specifying what it actually means, but I've often felt, speaking for me, that every so often, like maybe every decade or so, or 5 years, there ought to be some way of taking a reading on, and that's a whole other thing about what factors you use, but we just sort of go on as we are, and the people upstairs are doing whatever they're doing, but how are we doing?
Yeah, I think it's a
That's
critical question that's not asked very often, and it carries risks. I think, and money. I mean, it takes money, and whoever. I think I'd love to see an evaluation of our land use planning program, or any of our natural resource programs, or our state programs, and what would define success? That we've slowed the loss of
progress.
have we slowed the loss of farmland? Have we reversed it? Or we can do that. Pick a few other metrics and see how we're doing. I think it'd be important. But the irony, I think, is that one, could you find an evaluator that is both competent and trusted by all parties, so that whatever the report is would be sort of acknowledged, and I can't see that happening these days.
Just because of the political environment.
I think people's, I think in terms of a population, our understanding of our laws and our programs and our agencies has never been great. I think right now it's probably bad. And I just can't, I don't think anybody knows the purposes of government or agencies, what they're required to do, or how they're doing. I don't think they know where their tax money goes. I think they can't be bothered. I think they're busy. Attention spans are short these days. And so, if there was an evaluation, well, I guess I don't know that it would be embraced. I think people would cherry pick, what they want to hear. And the other thing too is, I'm not being very articulate.
Is part of that because the agencies haven't done a good job explaining what they do, or has it just become so complicated that it's hard to get the public to understand the complicated nature of what we do?
I think it's a number of things. Those included. I think agencies probably aren't resourced to do a great job educating people or providing public information. So they don't have money for it, probably. If they do get money for it, they begin to do it, they're probably accused of, propagandizing, proselytizing. Finding people who can do it well, explain, what the charge of the agency is, and kind of what the challenges are.
Without sounding political.
Without sounding political is hard. I think that what I'm talking about now presumes that there's a receptive public, that there are ears out there to hear what I think people ought to hear.
Yeah.
But if they don't get it on Facebook or Snapchat, it kind of doesn't register. And so I think there's a real problem in terms of governance of the governed. You know, we I think as a society aren't you know, it's really, people would have to take time, for example, to understand Oregon's land use planning program. You know, the way it registers with people now is when something happens they don't like, and then they get up in arms. For example, you know, if somebody wants to have a wedding venue at their vineyard, you know, the people locally may go, I don't want that. I don't want the crowds. That's not an agricultural use. You know, you're breaking faith with Oregon's land use planning goals. Or you know, the other way they're touched is, you know what? You know, I want to add a bedroom to my barn for the eclipse, and you know, that's something I've been wanting to do. And I went down to the city planner, and he said I couldn't do it. So you know, people are, you know, the best kind of regulation is the kind that never touches you. Mm-hmm. You know, and so I think our experience with the program is often, you know, when something happens we don't like.
How would you describe your working relations with other state agencies, DLCD, and interest groups in carrying out your land use coordination duties?
That's a mouthful.
Yeah, I mean, I think at the time we worked well with DLCD, working with Jim. You know, I think our commissions recognized, I mean, there's a balance and a choreography that happens between agencies, and I think it worked well.
Did your coordination agreement, quote unquote, that we have with you and with DEQ and what's close to 25 agencies, affect you in any way in terms of your behavior? I don't mean that the way that sounded, but affect your activities and your approach, and it was as much a thing of direction for the staff and the commissions as it was for others on the outside.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make any sense? What I'm trying to say is that we were told to, through statute, to have you coordinate,
mm-hmm.
and that is address the goals and address local plans. But having said that,
yeah,
there's a lot left unsaid.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious how it worked.
Well,
or didn't work. And should it continue to work today, like we ought to evaluate state agencies?
Yeah.
Now, that's a whole big chunk
Yeah.
right there, and you're going to find a lot of people resentful and arguing on all sides.
Yeah, I guess I came into it thinking this was a fair thing to do. I mean, if you look at the unparalleled historic effort that went into creating a land use planning program and 277 comprehensive plans and implementing ordinances, I mean, that is a huge chunk of change in time, and just an initiative almost unlike anything that had happened in Oregon before, I think. So if the state did that, it seems only fair that state agencies ought to, in some proportional way, be held to a similar obligation in terms of the seriousness of the planning program. So I thought that was fair, and I didn't see it as a bureaucratic, just a bureaucratic exercise. Roberta and I think we're fairly young, and I think we've got to give this our best shot.
We've had some great discussions with you guys and with other agency staffs that were one of very few in many organizations. And what do we do now? And well, this would we actually help write down.
So I think it worked well. And the only thing I'd add to my recollection, as hazy as it is that I think, because we're kind of true believers, we had to make the case to busy colleagues and managers and other. I mean, for example,
Your commission.
The commission, but the permitting folks. I mean, there's already a permitting backlog, and we were being roundly criticized for that, and it was mismanagement. I mean, just through the years. And here, we had a guy that was just a manager, just trying his best to get out from underneath that. And we're saying, add a couple things to the application, add process, add time. So, and we did, but I mean, I think it was a good lesson in trying to be clear about why we were doing this, and to try to find ways to do it with the least amount of bureaucratic burden on other staff or on the public. So,
Do you think Senate Bill 100 can be approved today?
no, no way. I think.
There's the political side of that,
Yeah.
as well as the policy side.
I don't think that there is the polity. I don't think there's the foundational agreement about who we are and what we want to be for anything of that dimension to get to first base.
So how did we lose that, do you think? Was it a period piece? It was the 70s and the environmental movement was strong.
There was that. And I think too, we're smaller. I mean, again, there's over twice as many people in Oregon as there were when that was,
Right.
and that just,
And most of those people don't know anything
and most
about
of them don't know anything about it.
The program,
And
yeah.
if you take a look at like Hector McPherson, I mean, you had citizen statesmen, sort of.
Yeah.
We had, the leadership was different.
Yeah.
And you had people who had more skin in the game with natural resource management. I mean,
Yeah.
now there's a schism. I mean, I think you had people, from the metro areas that, go to Home Depot to get wood for their deck on Saturday and complain about logging on Monday, So I mean, there's this, there's this loss of experience, loss of commonality, where, when I grew up in Oregon, the timber companies, I mean, they ravaged the land, really. But at the same time, everybody knew somebody, who had a job in the mill. You could have a job in the mill.
That's true.
I mean, if you're in Philomath
Yeah.
and you graduated from high school, you could have life after that
Yeah.
without going to college.
Yeah, I worked in Roseburg, same
So,
thing.
yeah,
It's
and
unbelievable.
so I think it's just such a different situation. We've got a different economy, we've got different rules in place, and slights are not quickly forgotten. Southwest Oregon, soon we may have one or two fewer counties because they're going to go belly up.
Yeah.
And there's very little law enforcement in a couple of them, and their whole quality of life has collapsed. They've gone from a mill economy to a meth economy. Maybe that would have happened anyway, but it sure seemed kind of accelerated.
Well, they lost the ONC revenues.
They lost ONC revenues,
That was huge.
exactly, and the loss of the ONC revenues is tied to Clinton and the Spotted Owl. I mean, how the state, left those people behind in their view because of some bird, and
That's not exactly the way it happened, but that's the way that's
but
the
I
view
think
that
they're not
they
gonna
have.
they're not gonna.
That's how the story was
Yeah,
told, and so they.
or
have
like,
it.
the Siskiyou monuments being looked at now. You have Douglas County timber operators just saying how basically that the expansion of that area undercut their employment, and they're gonna go out of business unless it's sort of fixed. That's overstated, but I guess one of the reasons Senate Bill 100, I think, could happen was there was a growing environmental awareness. I think in a beautiful state like Oregon, there was a shared value in a give and take about, a way to compromise. And I don't know that that's there anymore. And everything has gotten so more fractured and intense in terms of disagreement. Our disagreements are really intense. Our agreements are lukewarm, I think. And I don't think that works to create anything like Senate Bill 100.
I have a quote from Tom McCall.
Okay.
Which I think, I'm not trying to flag his flag, but on the other hand, he was incredibly articulate about some basic values. And he said in 1973, Governor McCall's vision of Oregon's land use planning program, maybe you've even heard these words, we're talking about more than preserving the beauty of Oregon. We're talking about the growth of Oregon and how that growth can be accomplished in a sane manner. We're talking about the economy and the environment. We're talking about balance. In short, we're talking about people and the land.
Mhm.
I mean, there aren't answers here, but there's an expression, an
Division.
articulation of what he felt the planning program should do and be.
Mhm.
Now, the words are great.
Mhm.
How do we follow up on that?
Mhm.
Have we followed up on that? Or have we moved away from that altogether and just letting people go off on their own? And I'm not saying it's that bad, but in certain places,
Well,
you know, it's just, it's tough.
Well, I'm the board president of the Straub Environmental Center here, and we've
Right.
recently been able to sort of reestablish our communications with the Straub family. And it's been fascinating to learn how, for example, Pat Straub really, I think, was probably the environmental conscience of Bob Straub, but how Bob was the politico, shake hands, and you could get stuff done. And if you take a look at the 70s and what was done, Senate Bill 100, Beach Bill, Bottle Bill.
Yeah.
Again, are those just sort of the freak manifestations of a special time in history? Or is I think it has to do with leadership too.
Well, there was an ethic there that
An ethic
doesn't
and
seem-
leadership.
seems to be missing now. I don't know why.
Well,
but,
yeah, and I think
There's no consensus.
There's no consensus.
There's no coming together.
and I think too,
There's a lot of suspicion too.
there's suspicion, and the easy. Forgive me. I mean, not saying the Bottle Bill was easy, but the easy stuff's kind of been done.
Yeah.
When you talk about trying to reverse climate change, yeah, I don't know how to do that. Or if you right now, if you want to, if you want to improve water quality, back in the 60s and 70s, first of all, there's a federal chunk of change to help you, and they got the solids, if you will, out of the water, and they have tertiary treatment. But now, if you want to get even better water, how do you remove the pharmaceuticals that aren't removed?
Right.
The caffeine,
Yeah.
the heavy metals that are a legacy of industrial development.
So
they're-
everything's more expensive.
Everything's more expensive, and everything's hard.
Yeah.
Everything's hard, and so I think that plays into it too.
Let's see, we might have touched on this, but is the state land use program equipped to address and properly respond to major changes in Oregon, population growth, economy, climate change, et cetera? Or do you think there's more changes needed? Or is there a way to even do that after
Yeah,
what we've discussed?
I don't think there's any instrument or combination of instruments available to Oregon to do an effective job with any of those. I mean, population growth is apparently irreversible. I mean, it's just, at least in this part of the country. And, I think the way we live makes having more people here a really hard environmental challenge.
You say how we live, what do you mean by that?
I think we're Americans, and I think how we drive around, how we consume resources, how we use electricity. It's just that we have a fairly weighty impact on the place, and it's if we're going to, we could double our population by the end of the century, particularly if we have climate refugees. And that, I mean, that's one of the reasons I think we had ballot measures. We had, if you forgive me, new people come in here and not appreciate the land use planning program. So I think we could be swamped with new people who just want a regular kind of life without the sort of 1970s ornaments of environmental protection. I mean, I can see that happening. But, so climate change, in terms of resilience, I know we have a resilience program, but if you want to take, I was on a climate technical advisory panel for the Willamette Basin, and they're talking about wildfires in the Cascade 9 times the level, 9 times the area than what we have now. And they're talking about, in some ways we're very lucky to have the reservoirs and the precipitation pattern, but it will change. And for some of the, and there are farms along there, and there are people all around there. And I don't think that I just don't see evidence that we're really, we're managing around the edges of that change. And maybe we'll deflect
And
it
a lack
little.
of leadership, or lack of education, or a lot of things.
Probably both.
I don't know. I guess I don't see much leadership. I mean, and in part because I don't think we allow leaders anymore. I mean,
Yeah, well,
I just, forgive me. We've talked about Straub, we've talked about McCall. I mean, you talk about, for me, the old like Jason Bowe, and these old names of these states people that were prominent, and now name a leader. Name a leader in Oregon. Who would that be? Head of Oregon State? President of Oregon State? Would it be the governor? Who carries weight? Who marshals public opinion to the point where that enables change? I mean, again, I'm not faulting any of the people that have stepped forward in difficult times politically to be elected. It's because talk about a thankless job.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I think if you just get your leadership detection wand out, you're not picking up. I'm not picking up anything.
If you were again involved in such an undertaking and had the chance to influence the development of a new comprehensive land use planning program, what lessons learned from Oregon's approach would you borrow, and which aspects of the program would you avoid?
or keep, right?
Yeah.
Things
I
to
think,
keep.
Yeah.
well, certainly the way it started out with a lot of public input was a good thing. How you do that today, I think there needs to be transparency of public involvement, but I don't know how you do it today. I just don't know how you get to people. You've been to a public hearing lately? Are they useful? It's just a shouting match, probably. And of necessity.
We had our days where we sat through a lot.
Well, it's just gotten worse. But anyway,
Yeah.
so I think the respect for public input was a good thing. How you translate that, if we were to do it again, I don't know. I think that the concept of the balance between state and local interests was, as part of the superstructure of Oregon's land use planning program is a good thing. I think I would think that the goal array is kind of funny to me. I think I'd change that up because there are some goals that are results from land use policies, and it's kind of an odd mix of goals to me in some ways. I think
they all appear to carry the same weight, but in reality they don't.
Good point.
So
In terms of how they're weighted, and some probably have staled through the years. I mean, in some ways, your question is kind of, if we had a constitutional convention, what part of the Bill of Rights would we keep? And it's a dicey thought, but the Willamette River Greenway, I like that there is one, but when I was working in Portland, when we wanted to get more people to the river so that they could appreciate the new water quality opportunity they had for boating and swimming even, the Greenway was you couldn't do anything. So anyway, that's, and coastal goals too. Anyway, so I think I would think more about the goals. I'd also think more about the interactions, how to integrate what are now compelling and powerful, have until recently been compelling and powerful federal programs like the Endangered Species Act, Clean Water Act, or the state, equivalents of the same, the State Endangered Species Act, that sort of thing. And I'm wondering too if, just from a conservation framing, if there are some land trusts and things like that wouldn't be necessarily. I'm wondering if there isn't a role for land trusts to come in here, or to create an environment where land trusts are working more with local jurisdictions. to kind of invite that through some new process. I don't know.
Let me close with an anecdote. That's
Okay.
an experience from a hearing that I attended, for which Greg Wolf and I, it was a Goal 4 hearing.
Okay.
We went up to Bob Straub's house, sat down with Bob and
Yeah.
Pat,
Okay.
and we tried to convince, and did, convince former Governor Straub to come to the hearing to speak on behalf of Goal 4.
Okay.
Which was the forest goal and
Yeah.
changes we were making. And it was at the fairgrounds.
Okay.
And he came to the hearing, a gracious man. I mean,
Mhm.
really, you talk about McCall and Straub.
Yeah.
And Jim has one of his favorite stories of having both Straub and McCall at the final adoption hearing. of
December of
goals.
'73,
Ooh.
where we had the two of them sing like this.
Wow.
Side by side.
Really?
Republican, Democrat,
Yeah,
all
yeah, yeah.
agreeing this
One
is,
outgoing, one.
this is what's good for Oregon.
Yeah.
And we got Governor Straub to come to the hearing and
Yeah.
testify, and I've never seen a crowd so disrespectful.
Oh, no,
I mean,
really?
it was
Oh,
heartbreaking.
at the
Yeah,
fairgrounds.
at the fairground. I mean, here, we asked him to come because he
Yeah.
could speak from the historic
Yeah.
sense of how
Yeah.
important
Yeah.
these changes were, and we had a crowd of my language, yahoos, that came, and just, it didn't matter who he was.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
And
When
so-
was this?
This was probably in the late 80s, I
Okay.
guess.
Yeah.
86 maybe, or something.
Yeah.
I don't remember the date, but
Yeah.
talk about how things have changed, and, it's just, anyway, it was kind of disheartening to see
It would
a
be.
great man be treated the way that he
Yeah.
totally undeserved.
Yeah. So
And it didn't bother him. I mean, he's been through stuff,
Yeah.
at least outwardly. He
Yeah.
still went ahead and didn't back down.
what a shame. But already in the late '80s to have that kind of
Yeah.
temper overtake a civic process. So
Yeah.
let's do that.
Anyway, on behalf of Portland State University and those of us involved in this oral history project of Oregon's land use planning program, I'd like to thank you for allowing us to interview you.
Well, you're welcome.
Appreciate it very
It's
much.
worth what you paid for it.
I want to continue this conversation. I don't know where it's going to go, but
Okay.
you're very thoughtful about other ideas we have ourselves.
Well, I think this is a great resource that you guys are creating, and hopefully it will be used. I just hope that it's put somehow. I hope the thoughts are leveraged into today, and tomorrow. So.
Well, we have another generation coming along, and here we are, some of us are
Yeah.
at our 70th year.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, holy,
I mean,
blank.
I don't think this is just old guys griping, I think it's more important than that. But I think if a young person heard what I just said, they'd, dismiss it.
Well, I don't know. You've got a lot of folks on our hearing that, on our webpage that will
Well,
use this for student research.
I will go take a look.